Dr. Edward Kian. I do go by Ted, which was my nickname growing up, and my sports writing name was Ted Kian, K-I-A-N. My titles here is pretty complex, are Distinguished Visiting Professor and Welch Bridgewater Endowed Chair of Sports Media. I'm technically here on a short-term contract, and I also held the title of Associate Professor of Sport Administration at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. I like to do interview-based research where I'm using my reporting and interview skills as well as my contacts and then writing that a little bit more in a journalistic type narrative than you see in academic mumbo-jumbo. It's maybe more interesting to some of a broader base of readers. And so I've done a lot of stuff on that, looking at the attitudes and experiences of sports journalists. The final thing I look at is when I look at the actual content produced, and I'm usually looking at print because it's easier for me to analyze. And when I look at the actual content produced, I look to see, does the sex of the author or journalist influence the content? In other words, if you have a woman writing about sports, how does she write about women's sports? We can count up the number of articles she has on women's versus men's, but that may not be an indicator of where her interest is because you generally are assigned that by your editor or your producer, depending on what type of medium you're in. However, what I do is look at it where you cover up the author's name and you code, and then you don't know what sex the person is who's writing it, and to see, do they write differently about men's sports and women's sports? Well, what's caught my attention is there's so little research done on the actual attitudes of journalists and editors, all right, where people haven't, there's been a few surveys, okay, but people, and a few interview-based studies, but not much. And that's something that catches my eye because it takes time to do these kind of interview-based studies or access to do surveys, which are harder to distribute now because, like in the idea of newspapers, first of all, newspapers have lost a lot of staff across the country. Second, reporters no longer, for the most part, big-time reporters do not go into the office. Everybody's filing remotely from home, from games, from travel. And so sending out a survey to the office saying distribute it to your sports department is no longer a viable means, all right? So you've really got to chase people down and track them. And that's what attracts my eye because it's an area where I have contacts. Other people here at Oklahoma State do as well because everybody here has industry experience, which is a strength of the department. So they have contacts, and then you could focus more on that because what we do is we see in research a lot of analyses of actual media content, whether it be television, radio, newspaper, internet, etc., where you look at the content and you analyze it, all right? And then they try to say, oh, well, this writer thinks this or this writer thinks that. Well, oftentimes the writer is just conveying a message, and usually it's going through multiple channels of editing. And they say, oh, this writer emphasizes football because that's all he covers. Well, is that all he wants to cover, or is he being assigned to cover that as part of his beat? I would argue it's often more the latter, all right? You're usually assigned your topics unless you're a top-tier columnist. Then maybe you get to choose where you want to go, but for most folks, you're assigned it. So that's where I look at is looking at what we call the media gatekeepers. And by that, some people think of just editors, producers, but that also includes writers, copy editors, and they're the people that decide what stories are worthy of coverage, how much coverage and emphasis to give them. Now, when you talk about emphasis, whether they go front page, whether the lead story, when you talk about 5-minute local sportscast, you could fill that with 2 hours, but what are you going to get into those little sound bites and how much emphasis are you going to give to it? Who are you going to send out? Are you just going to give a score? Are you going to send somebody out to cover? What have you not? And so look at that in terms of the time. And the idea is to look more and examine more where you're interviewing people and doing surveys to find out what the media members, media gatekeepers think about various issues of the day.